The Grand Council chamber sparkled with light from 3 distant suns. Emperor Thalen sat high on his throne, looking down at the visitors from across the galaxy. His 4 eyes moved slowly over each group, and his expression showed he was not impressed. It was the year 2247, and representatives from dozens of different alien species had come to this important meeting. The human group stood in a small corner of the huge room. Ambassador Richard Hayes stood with his team, knowing that the other species did not respect them very much. Humans had only learned how to travel faster than light 50 years ago. Compared to civilizations that had been sailing between stars for thousands of years, humans were like babies learning to walk. Behind the human delegation, almost invisible to everyone, was Thomas Parker. He wore a simple gray uniform that marked him as a janitor. A cleaning cart sat quietly near the wall. Thomas worked the night shift at the human embassy. He was 42 years old and had asked for this job specifically. He liked the quiet, empty corridors better than the busy diplomatic life. The feast had been going on for 3 hours when Emperor Thalen stood up from his throne. His jeweled robes fell around him like liquid metal. Servants pushed forward a floating platform that carried a crystal object about the size of a human head. The artifact glowed within a light. Its surface was covered with complex patterns that seemed to move and change when you looked at them from different angles. "Look at this." Thalen's voice boomed through the chamber. Translation devices immediately changed his words into dozens of languages. "This is a data core from the precursors themselves." Everyone in the room gasped at once. The precursors were an extinct civilization whose technology was the foundation of everything the galaxy used today. For 30,000 years, people had found their artifacts on dead worlds. Nobody understood their purpose. Nobody could read their language. Thalen's eyes glittered as he looked at his guests. He had drunk too much fermented Zelen, which was like wine for his species. His normal self-control had disappeared, replaced by dangerous confidence mixed with theatrical pride. For thousands of years, the greatest minds in the galaxy have tried to read the precursor language, the Emperor continued. He gestured dramatically at the crystal. Linguists, mathematicians, quantum theorists, all have failed. He paused to let everyone think about that failure. "I have a challenge. A bet. I will give all the gold in my personal treasury, 10,000 weight stones, to anyone who can translate even one single phrase from this core." The chamber erupted with excited voices. 10,000 weight stones of Vaxane gold meant wealth beyond imagination. It was enough money to buy entire star systems. Ambassador Hayes leaned toward Margaret Stevens, his cultural expert. "It's a safe bet for him," she whispered. "Every major university in the galaxy has departments studying the precursors. If someone could do it, they would have done it centuries ago." One by one, representatives from different species approached the crystal. A Keltharian chief scholar, with tentacles that glowed with concentration, studied the artifact for 20 minutes. She finally admitted she could not read it. 3 Mordian mathematicians worked together, using their hive-mind intelligence to examine the crystal's structure. They withdrew with frustrated clicking sounds. The human expert, Dr. Paul Richardson, looked at the core briefly before shaking his head. "I am sorry, Ambassador. We have studied precursor artifacts at Cambridge for decades. This is beyond what we understand." Emperor Thalen laughed loudly. The sound echoed off the crystal walls. "Of course it is. Did you really think you primitive newcomers might succeed where ancient civilizations have failed?" His 4 eyes fixed on the human delegation with clear mockery. "Perhaps your species should focus on learning basic interstellar navigation before trying to understand the precursors." Several alien species joined in the laughter. The humans stood in uncomfortable silence. Their faces turned red with embarrassment. That was when Thomas Parker stepped forward. He had stopped pushing his cleaning cart. His hand was raised slightly, asking permission to speak. Ambassador Hayes's eyes went wide with horror. A janitor interrupting an imperial gathering could create a diplomatic disaster that humanity could not afford. "Your Majesty," Thomas's voice was steady and respectful but clear. "If it pleases you, I would like to examine the artifact." The laughter died instantly. Everyone fell silent, stunned. Emperor Thalen's expression showed confusion, then disbelief, and finally cruel amusement. His mouth parts curled into what humans had learned was a Vaxane smile. "A human janitor? You want to try what has defeated the galaxy's finest minds?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "By all means." Thalen gestured broadly, settling back into his throne with obvious delight. "Please, entertain us, cleaner of floors. Show us the hidden genius of humanity's custodial class." The assembled species erupted in fresh laughter. Some laughed cruelly, others seemed merely confused. Ambassador Hayes looked like he might faint. Thomas walked calmly to the suspended crystal. His worn boots made soft sounds on the polished floor. He reached out and lifted the artifact from its holder, turning it slowly in his hands. His fingers traced the patterns on its surface. His eyes followed the flowing lines and geometric shapes that covered every part of it. "May I borrow a data slate?" he asked. A vaccine servant, smirking, gave him one. Thomas set the crystal down carefully and began making notes on the slate. His fingers moved quickly. Sometimes he paused and lifted the crystal again to study a particular section. The chamber watched with a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment. Even the human delegation could not look at each other. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The gathered species began to grow restless. Some whispered among themselves. Others returned to their seats. 15 minutes passed. Thomas straightened up, holding the data slate. He looked up at Emperor Thalen. His expression was calm and professional, the same expression he wore when he finished cleaning a conference room. "Your Majesty," he said, "this is not just one phrase. This is a complete historical record of the precursor civilization. It describes their rise, their golden age, and the events that led to their disappearance. Would you like me to give you a short summary, or would you prefer the full translation?" The chamber fell absolutely silent. Not a single being moved. Not a breath was drawn. Emperor Thalen's 4 eyes narrowed. What kind of trick is this? The chaos in the Grand Council chamber took nearly 10 minutes to settle down. Representatives from different species shouted over one another in a dozen languages. Their translation devices created a loud mess of overlapping voices. Lord Vrex stood frozen at the crystal pedestal. The data slate was clutched in his clawed hands. His 4 eyes scanned the translated text again and again, as if hoping to find proof that this was fake. Emperor Thalen remained seated. His expression was impossible to read. The effects of the Zelen seemed to have disappeared completely, burned away by the shock of what had just happened. His political mind raced through implications and consequences. He calculated the damage to vaccine prestige and considered how to contain this unexpected development. Ambassador Hayes had moved to Thomas's side. His face was pale. "Thomas," he whispered urgently, "what have you done? How did you do this?" "Ambassador," Thomas interrupted gently, "perhaps we should let His Majesty speak first." Finally, Thalen raised his hand. Silence fell instantly. It was the silence of absolute authority. The Emperor rose from his throne and walked down the steps slowly. Each footstep was deliberate. He approached Thomas directly. All 4 eyes fixed on the human janitor with an intensity that made several nearby delegates step back nervously. "You will explain," Thalen said quietly. His voice carried a dangerous edge. "Exactly how a human custodial worker has accomplished what the galaxy's greatest scholars could not achieve in 30,000 years. Thomas met the Emperor's gaze without flinching. "Of course, Your Majesty. But first, I should clarify something important." He gestured to the crystal. "The precursor language is not actually a language. Not in the traditional sense that most species would understand it." "Then what is it?" Lord Vrex demanded. His voice was sharp with barely contained frustration. "Mathematics," Thomas replied simply. "Advanced, multidimensional mathematical notation. The precursors did not think in words or concepts the way we do. They thought in pure mathematical relationships." Margaret Stevens, the cultural expert, stepped forward cautiously. "But surely mathematical notation would be easier to decipher than a spoken language? Math is universal." "That is the problem," Thomas explained, warming to his subject. "You are right that basic mathematics is universal. Addition, subtraction, geometric principles. But the precursors went far beyond basic math. They developed mathematical frameworks that describe reality in ways most species simply do not think about." He picked up the crystal again. "Look at these patterns. What do you see?" "Symbols," said a Mordian delegate. "Perhaps phonetic characters." "Decorative patterns," offered a Caltharian scholar. "Artistic expression." Thomas shook his head. "These are mathematical proofs. Nested equations. Multidimensional calculus expressed in geometric form. The precursors did not separate their language from their mathematics. To them, describing reality mathematically was language." Lord Vrex's claws clicked against the data slate. "Our mathematicians have studied these artifacts for centuries. If this were merely mathematics—" "It is not merely mathematics," Thomas interrupted respectfully. It is their mathematics. They approached mathematical concepts from a completely different foundation than most modern species. Emperor Thalen's eyes narrowed. And yet you, a human janitor, somehow possess this different foundation. Thomas smiled slightly. No, Your Majesty. I just happen to have spent most of my life studying pure mathematics from a particular perspective that, by chance, aligned with how the precursors structured their thinking. Explain, Thalen commanded. Thomas set down the crystal and picked up the data slate. Most species in the galaxy developed mathematics in relatively similar ways because they share similar needs. You needed to count resources, measure distances, calculate trajectories for space travel. Your mathematics evolved to serve practical purposes. As did yours, Vrex pointed out. True, Thomas acknowledged. But humanity developed mathematics differently. Or rather, we developed multiple mathematical traditions independently across our planet. The Babylonians approached mathematics one way. The Greeks did it another way. The Indians had another approach. The Chinese had yet another. Islamic scholars contributed their own perspectives. European mathematicians built on all of these traditions while adding their own innovations. He pulled up an image on the slate. It showed different number systems and geometric proofs from Earth's history. We did not have a single, unified approach to mathematics until relatively recently in our development. Instead, we had dozens of different ways of thinking about mathematical relationships. Some focused on geometry. Others focused on algebra. Some on abstract theory. Others on practical computation. How does this help you read precursor script? Asked a Telmorian observer. Her voice was skeptical. Thomas zoomed in on a section of the crystal's pattern. Because the precursors used the same kind of multiple perspective approach, but taken to an extreme. They would describe a single concept using 3 or 4 different mathematical frameworks simultaneously, layered on top of each other. Most species look at this and see chaos or decorative complexity. But if you have spent years studying how different human mathematical traditions approach the same problems from different angles. He traced a flowing line on the crystal's surface. You start to recognize the pattern. He looked up at the assembled delegates. It also helped that humans are particularly good at one specific skill. Pattern recognition. We evolved as hunters on Earth. We tracked prey for hours or days by following tiny, seemingly unrelated clues. A bent blade of grass here. A disturbed pebble there. A scent on the wind. Our brains became extraordinarily good at finding patterns in apparent randomness. Thomas gestured to the crystal. The precursor mathematical notation is essentially a very complex pattern. Once I recognized that it was mathematics rather than language, and once I understood that it used multiple mathematical frameworks simultaneously, the rest was just patience. Following the pattern. The chamber had grown quiet as Thomas spoke. Several scholars were nodding slowly, beginning to understand. Emperor Thalen studied Thomas for a long moment. You said you have spent most of your life studying pure mathematics. What is a mathematician doing working as a janitor on a diplomatic vessel? Thomas smiled. I have a doctorate in pure mathematics from Cambridge University on Earth, Your Majesty. I specialized in abstract algebra and number theory. After I completed my degree, I discovered that I found academic life stressful. Too many competing egos. Too much pressure to publish. Too much politics. He shrugged. I took a position as a custodian because I find the work peaceful. It pays my way while I travel the galaxy. I get to see new places and meet interesting people. And I have my evenings free to think about mathematics without pressure or deadlines. You are a janitor by choice. Lord Vrex sounded as though the concept physically pained him. Yes, Thomas said simply. I enjoy it. The following morning, Thomas arrived at the Imperial Archives precisely at 6 in the morning. This was his usual starting time. He had spent the night in his small quarters aboard the human diplomatic vessel, sleeping soundly despite having potentially sparked the most significant scientific breakthrough in galactic history. Old habits, he had learned, were comforting in times of change. Lord Vrex was waiting for him at the archive's entrance, flanked by 6 Vaxane scholars. The High Scholar had clearly not slept. His ceremonial robes were wrinkled, and his eyes held the frantic energy of someone whose entire worldview had been turned upside down in a single evening. Parker, Vrex said tersely, skipping formalities. Before we proceed with His Majesty's interspecies research team, I must verify. Independently verify. The precursor core you translated last night. I need you to translate another section. A specific section. With witnesses. Thomas nodded, understanding the need. Of course, Lord Vrex. Scientific rigor demands verification. They entered the archives. It was a vast, circular chamber whose walls rose hundreds of feet, lined with carefully preserved artifacts from 1,000 worlds. At the center of the room, the precursor crystal sat on an examination pedestal, surrounded by scanning equipment and holographic displays. The 6 vaccine scholars positioned themselves at monitoring stations while Vrex led Thomas to the crystal. The High Scholar's claws moved across a holographic interface, highlighting a specific section of the crystal's surface. It was a dense cluster of geometric patterns that seemed to fold in on themselves in impossible ways. This section, Vrex said. His voice was tight with controlled emotion. 3 generations of my family have studied this section. My grandmother dedicated 40 years to it. She believed it contained mathematical principles that could revolutionize our understanding of quantum mechanics. He fixed Thomas with an intense stare. Tell me what it says. Thomas leaned forward, studying the indicated patterns. His fingers hovered over the crystal's surface, not quite touching, as his eyes followed the flowing lines and nested shapes. The scholars watched their monitors intently, tracking his eye movements and his breathing, searching for any sign of deception or lucky guessing. After 5 minutes, Thomas spoke. Your grandmother was correct, Lord Vrex. This is about quantum mechanics, but not in the way modern species understand it. He pointed to a spiral pattern. The precursors did not see quantum uncertainty as a limitation of measurement. They saw it as fundamental to reality structure. A feature, not a bug. Thomas pulled up a holographic stylus and began drawing supplementary equations in the air. This section describes what they called probability cascades. The mathematics of how quantum states influence everyday reality. But they approached it through a kind of geometric algebra that does not exist in any modern mathematical framework. He continued translating. His voice fell into a steady rhythm. The precursors, he explained, had discovered that quantum mechanics and general relativity were not incompatible theories. They were different perspectives on the same underlying mathematical structure. The crystal described techniques for manipulating that structure directly, allowing for what modern species would consider impossible. Stable manipulation of quantum states at large scales. Controlled probability manipulation. Even limited observation of time. As Thomas spoke, one of the vaccine scholars gasped and rushed to her console. Lord Vrex. I am cross-referencing his translation with known precursor technology artifacts. The principles he is describing match the energy signatures we have detected but never understood. The mathematical relationships align with unexplained phenomena in Sector 719. Another scholar called out excitedly. The quantum resonance patterns in precursor power systems. If we apply these principles, they suddenly make sense. Lord Vrex stood rigid. His claws gripped the edge of the examination pedestal. When Thomas finished translating the section, the High Scholar was silent for a long moment. My grandmother, Vrex said quietly, spent 40 years translating 3 symbols. She believed they meant wave, particle, and observer. He looked at Thomas. You just explained in 10 minutes that those were not words at all. They were a complex mathematical proof describing the relationship between quantum observation and reality itself. Your grandmother was on the right track, Thomas said gently. She correctly identified the core concepts. She just did not have the mathematical framework to connect them. Vrex's claws clicked against the pedestal. It was a vaccine gesture Thomas had learned indicated deep emotional distress. 40 years, the High Scholar repeated. Then he seemed to gather himself, drawing on reserves of professional discipline. Very well. The verification is complete. You can truly read precursor script. He straightened his robes. His Majesty has commanded the formation of the interspecies research team. Let us begin assembling it. Over the next 3 hours, representatives from 14 species gathered in the Imperial Archives. Emperor Thalen had issued the invitation personally, and few beings in the galaxy were foolish enough to decline an Imperial summons. The team included human scientists, vaccine scholars, Keltharian linguists whose species processed information through light patterns, a Mordian collective of 5 individuals who shared thoughts instantly, Telmorian probability mathematicians, and representatives from 6 other species, each bringing unique ways of thinking. Thomas stood before them in the central archive chamber, still wearing his grey custodial uniform. He had politely declined Lord Vrex's offer of formal scholar's robes. Thank you all for coming, Thomas began. I want to start by addressing what I think might be some misconceptions about yesterday's events. He gestured to himself. I did not solve an impossible problem. I got lucky. I happened to have the right tools for this specific puzzle. But what I did was not genius. It was pattern recognition combined with a particular educational background. He activated a holographic display, showing the precursor crystal rotating slowly. The real work begins now. This core contains approximately 47,000 individual entries. Last night, I translated maybe 24. That is roughly 0.05% of the total content. At my current pace, working alone, it would take me several years to translate everything. And that is assuming I do not make errors, which is unlikely. Dr. Helen Foster spoke up. So you need our help with the volume. Not just volume, Thomas replied. I need your perspectives. He zoomed in on a section of the crystal. I can read precursor mathematical notation now, but understanding what it means, the implications, the applications, the connections to modern science, that requires expertise I do not have. When I translate a section about precursor energy systems, I need physicists to tell me how that connects to modern physics. When I describe their quantum theories, I need Lord Vrex to identify which precursor technologies might be operating on those principles. He looked at the Keltharian linguists. Your species processes information through pattern-based light. You might see connections in the precursor mathematics that I miss entirely. The Mordian collective, your shared mind might parallel how the precursors thought about distributed information systems. Thomas turned to the Telmorian representatives. And your species' natural understanding of quantum probability could be crucial for understanding the sections I am finding most difficult to translate. One of the Telmorians clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. You are suggesting the precursors might have thought more like us than like Vaxians or humans. I am suggesting they might have thought like all of us, in different ways, simultaneously, Thomas said. The research vessel dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Sector 719. Every screen on the bridge filled with the image of what awaited them. Even the Vaxian captain, a veteran of 40 years of space exploration, drew in a sharp breath. The precursor facility hung in space like a geometric impossibility. It was a structure that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the three-dimensional universe should allow. Its surface was made of the same crystalline material as the data core, but on a scale that defied understanding. The facility was easily 50 kilometers across, rotating slowly in a perfect orbit around a dead star. By the ancestors, Lord Vrex whispered. We have surveyed this structure a dozen times, but I have never seen it look like this. Dr. Helen Foster checked her instruments. It is not the structure that has changed. It is responding to us. Energy readings are increasing. The crystalline surface is beginning to emit light. Thomas stood at the observation window, data slate in hand, comparing what he saw with the translated descriptions from the precursor core. It is detecting our presence. The facility is designed to activate when multiple intelligent species approach together. He scrolled through his notes. The precursors called it a convergence trigger. The facility will not fully activate for a single species. Only for a diverse group. So humanity approaching alone would not activate it? Ambassador Hayes asked. No. Neither would the Vaxians alone, or any single species. It requires different ways of thinking. Thomas pulled up a diagram. According to the core, the facility contains what the precursors called perspective chambers. Each chamber is designed to test a different way of understanding reality. No single species could pass all the tests. Captain Edward Grant, the human military officer, frowned. Tests? Your Majesty, this sounds increasingly like a trap. Emperor Thalen, participating through holographic communication from the Imperial homeworld, considered this. Or it is exactly what the precursors intended. A filter to ensure only species capable of cooperation could access their knowledge. There is more, Thomas added. The core mentions something called the warning. A message the precursors left for future species. It is encoded in the facility's central chamber, but it can only be accessed after completing the perspective tests. Lord Vrex's claws clicked against his console. Parker, are these tests dangerous? Thomas scrolled through the translation. The text says they are calibrated to challenge without causing permanent harm, but it is not specific about what permanent harm means to beings who could manipulate quantum reality. Comforting, Dr. Foster muttered. The expedition team assembled in the ship's main briefing room. Thomas had selected a small group for the initial facility entry. Himself, Dr. Foster, Lord Vrex, two Mordian collective members named John and Robert, a Keltharian linguist named Dr. Alice Bell, and two Telmorian probability specialists. Captain Grant insisted on accompanying them with a security detail of 6 soldiers. Remember, Thomas addressed the group, the precursors designed this facility for multiple species to solve together. If we encounter problems, our first instinct should be to work together, not compete. They transported to the facility's exterior using a shuttle. The crystalline surface seemed to ripple as they approached, and a perfectly circular opening appeared, just large enough for their small ship. "Well," Captain Grant said, checking his weapon, "at least they are welcoming." The shuttle passed through the opening into a vast interior chamber. The walls glowed with soft blue light, and the geometric patterns covering every surface seemed to shift and flow like liquid. Thomas consulted his data slate. "According to the core, we should proceed to the central atrium. From there, pathways will open to individual perspective chambers." They walked across the crystalline floor. Their footsteps made no sound. The air had a strange quality, as if it existed at a slightly different temperature around each person. Dr. Alice Bell's light patterns flickered rapidly. "I am reading the patterns on these walls. They are instructions. But they are written in a mathematical language I do not fully understand." "Let me see." Thomas approached the wall she indicated. His eyes followed the flowing patterns. "It is explaining how the perspective chambers work. Each chamber will present a problem that requires a specific way of thinking to solve. The problems are not competitive. They are diagnostic. The facility is trying to understand how we think." "Why?" Lord Vrex asked. "To determine if we are ready for whatever the precursors left behind." They reached the central atrium. It was a spherical chamber hundreds of meters across, with 6 doorways spaced evenly around the perimeter. Each doorway glowed with a different color: red, blue, green, yellow, purple, and white. As they entered the atrium, a voice filled the chamber. It was not sound exactly. More like a thought that appeared directly in their minds, translated instantly into each being's native language. "Welcome, Seekers. You have demonstrated the first requirement. Diversity of thought. Proceed to the chambers. Understanding awaits." "Well," Dr. Foster said, "I suppose that is encouraging." Thomas checked his slate. The core describes 6 chamber types: pattern recognition, probability manipulation, quantum observation, temporal perception, multidimensional geometry, and collective consciousness. He looked at the team. "I think we should divide according to our natural strengths." They discussed and decided. Thomas and Dr. Bell would attempt pattern recognition. The Telmorians would try probability manipulation. Lord Vrex and Dr. Foster would tackle quantum observation. The Mordian collective would attempt collective consciousness. They would leave temporal perception and multidimensional geometry for later attempts if needed. "What about us?" Captain Grant asked, gesturing to his security team. "You wait here," Thomas said. "If something goes wrong, you will need to extract us." Each group approached their designated doorway. Thomas and Dr. Bell stood before the green glowing entrance to the pattern recognition chamber. "Ready?" Thomas asked. Dr. Bell's patterns pulsed in agreement. "Let us see what the precursors' thought patterns were." They stepped through together. The chamber beyond was unlike anything Thomas had expected. It was not a room. It was a space filled with flowing light, each beam moving in complex patterns that wove around and through each other. The patterns existed in 3 dimensions, shifting and changing constantly. The precursor voice returned. "Identify the fundamental pattern that generates all observed sequences. Time limit relative to your perception." Thomas and Dr. Bell stood still, watching the light patterns flow around them. Minutes passed. The patterns seemed random at first, but gradually Thomas began to notice repetitions. Not exact repetitions, but variations on underlying themes. "It is fractal," he murmured. "Each large pattern contains smaller versions of itself." "But it is also temporal," Dr. Bell added, her light matching some of the pattern frequencies. "The patterns repeat over time, but with phase shifts. See? That sequence appeared 30 seconds ago, but offset by 7 degrees. They worked together. Thomas identified the mathematical structure while Dr. Bell's pattern recognition biology tracked the temporal variations. After 20 minutes, they understood. The entire display was generated by a single, elegant equation that created infinite variation through recursive self-reference. Thomas reached out and touched the air where he calculated the equation's origin point would be. The flowing lights froze, then combined into a single, perfect geometric form. The visual representation of the generating equation. Pattern recognized. Cognitive strength identified. Multidimensional pattern synthesis. Proceed. The chamber dissolved, and they found themselves back in the atrium. One by one, the other teams emerged from their chambers. The Telmorians had successfully manipulated probability fields to navigate a chamber where every action had uncertain outcomes. Lord Vrex and Dr. Foster had worked together to observe quantum states without collapsing them, a feat considered impossible by modern physics. The Mordian collective had synchronized their shared mind with the facilities systems, achieving perfect communication. Thomas stood before the white doorway marked temporal perception. This one worries me. The translation was not clear about what temporal perception means to beings who might have experienced time differently than we do. He stepped through the doorway. The chamber beyond was wrong. Thomas could not quite explain how, but the space did not follow normal rules. He saw himself entering the chamber, but also saw himself having already solved the puzzle, and also saw himself failing and leaving. All three states existed at the same time. The precursor voice spoke. Navigate probability streams to the optimal outcome. Time is not linear here. Thomas stood very still, thinking. He thought about his unique background, the janitor with a mathematics degree who had accidentally become the key to unlocking precursor knowledge. He thought about the probability that had led him to this exact moment. And he understood. Time was not the challenge. Choice was. The chamber was showing him that every decision created branching possibilities. The precursors wanted to see if he could identify which choices led to the best outcomes without experiencing all the branches. It was, essentially, a probability calculation extended across time. Thomas closed his eyes and worked through the mathematics in his mind. He could not see time the way the precursors did, but he could calculate probability distributions for future states. He could identify which current actions led to which future outcomes. He opened his eyes and walked forward, making a series of specific choices. Turning left instead of right at a junction. Touching one crystal instead of another. Speaking a calculated sequence of prime numbers. The chamber stabilized. The multiple probability streams collapsed into a single, coherent timeline. Temporal probability navigation achieved. Cognitive strength identified. Linear beings achieving nonlinear solutions. Proceed. Thomas emerged to find the entire team waiting anxiously. 5 chambers completed, Lord Vrex said. Only multidimensional geometry remains. They all looked at the purple doorway. Thomas consulted his slate. This is the one I am least equipped for. The translation suggests it requires visualizing more than 3 spatial dimensions at the same time. Dr. Foster thought for a moment. Wait. Did you not say the precursors used multidimensional mathematical notation? That their script exists in more than 3 dimensions? Thomas nodded slowly. You are right. I have been reading 4-dimensional mathematics for days now. I just have not been conscious of it as spatial dimensions. I have been thinking of them as abstract mathematical dimensions. Perhaps that is good enough, Lord Vrex suggested. Perhaps the precursors do not require us to perceive exactly as they did. Only to find our own way to the same understanding. Thomas and Dr. Foster entered the purple doorway together. The multidimensional geometry chamber was simultaneously the most beautiful and most incomprehensible space Thomas had ever experienced. Geometric shapes existed in configurations that should not be possible. Spheres that were somehow also cubes. Lines that curved without bending. Surfaces that had more than 2 sides while remaining perfectly flat. Construct a pathway through 4-dimensional space using 3-dimensional actions. They worked together for nearly an hour. Dr. Foster used her linguistic training to identify patterns in how the shapes responded to interaction, while Thomas calculated the mathematical relationships between 3-dimensional manipulations and 4-dimensional results. Slowly, piece by piece, they constructed a pathway. Not through 3-dimensional space, but through the 4th dimension as expressed in their limited framework. When the final piece locked into place, the impossible geometry suddenly made perfect sense. Multidimensional cognition achieved through abstraction. Cognitive strength identified. Finding alternative routes to understanding. Proceed. They emerged into the atrium to find all 6 doorways now glowing with steady, warm light. In the center of the spherical chamber, a new opening had appeared. A swirling vortex of crystalline light that led downward. Convergence achieved. The warning awaits. Descend together. The entire team gathered at the edge of the vortex. They descended through the crystalline light together, all 12 members of the expedition team. They emerged into a vast chamber. The walls displayed images, not holographic projections, but actual windows into other places and times. Thomas saw precursor civilization at its height. Cities that existed in multiple dimensions at once. beings of pure energy and thought working on projects that reshaped reality itself. And then he saw why they had disappeared. In the center of the chamber, a final precursor artifact activated. The precursor voice spoke one last time. We are the precursors. We who came before. We leave this message for those who follow, for those who achieve what we could not. True convergence. The images on the walls shifted, showing the precursors' history. They had reached the peak of technological achievement. They could manipulate matter and energy at will. They could travel through time and across dimensions. They had become, in essence, gods. But in their advancement, they had lost something crucial. They had achieved such unity of thought, such perfect synchronization, that they stopped being individuals. They became a single consciousness, distributed across the galaxy but lacking any diversity of perspective. We solved every problem, the voice continued, heavy with something that might have been regret. We achieved perfection. And in our perfection, we stagnated. We could no longer grow, no longer adapt, no longer create anything truly new. We had eliminated all contradiction, all conflict, all difference. The images showed the precursors' desperate attempts to restore diversity to their civilization. They seeded hundreds of worlds with new intelligent species, each designed with different ways of thinking. They built facilities like this one to test whether those species could achieve what the precursors could not. Advancement through cooperation rather than assimilation. You have passed our tests, the voice said. Not because you are superior, but because you remain different from each other. You humans see patterns. You Telmorians navigate probability. You Keltharians process through biological light. You Vaxians calculate with perfect precision. You Mordians share thoughts while remaining individuals. The central artifact began to glow brighter. We leave you our knowledge. Our technology. Our understanding of reality. But we leave you also a warning. Never sacrifice your diversity for the sake of unity. Convergence without difference is death. Cooperation between unique minds is the only path to true advancement. The artifact pulsed, and suddenly Thomas understood. Not just intellectually, but deeply. Intelligence was not a single quality to be maximized. It was a spectrum, a collection of different approaches to understanding reality.